Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the most complex human experiences, pull apart the psychological, social, and biological threads, and give you the essential understanding of what's truly driving them.
Today, we're undertaking one of our most intimate and complex missions,
Yeah.
a deep dive into human desire and sexual identity. And this isn't a fixed landscape at all. It's a shifting, responsive terrain shaped by everything from your nervous system to your social world.
Yeah, if you came here thinking that sexuality was a simple on-off switch, well, prepare for a complete and, I think, a really necessary conceptual upgrade.
hmm
Our sources for this are pretty dense. We're covering cutting-edge research on sexual fluidity, clinical studies on the long-term impact of trauma, even non-sexual trauma on intimacy.
Right. So our goal here is to really unpack the science behind desire, reveal the surprising ways attraction can shift and flow, and look, critically at the profound and often silent shadow that major life experiences, especially trauma, cast over our intimate lives.
And we promise you, the learner, some key actionable insights into why your desire might feel inconsistent, why identity can be genuinely fluid, and maybe most importantly, how building a secure emotional foundation is probably the single greatest determinant of long-term sexual satisfaction.
This should arm you with the context you need to move from confusion to, hopefully, a more compassionate self-understanding.
Okay, let's unpack this core concept first and really move beyond the superficial. When we talk about sexual desire, we often isolate it. We think, oh, it's just a biological urge, right?
Mm.
But the research shows it's far more fundamental than that.
It absolutely is. I mean, if you strip away the mechanics and all the societal expectations, desire is fundamentally the drive to feel alive.
To feel connected.
Exactly. Connected and seen. Sexual desire is simply one powerful, very physical expression of that universal human need. It's the motivation to seek closeness, novelty, pleasure.
So it stems from the same place as wanting to create art or just laugh with friends.
It all comes from that same wellspring, a yearning to be vibrant and present in the world.
And because it's such a fundamental drive, we've wrapped it in decades of cultural baggage, which has led to some incredibly restrictive and often damaging myths. We need to just bust those right out of the gate.
Absolutely. The first one is the big one, the pervasive, frankly ageist myth that sexual vitality is strictly defined by youth or physical appearance.
Right, that there's a peak and then it's all downhill.
Yeah, and that idea is just not borne out by the reality of human experience. We see in these huge longitudinal studies that many adults in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they are reporting fulfilling and highly satisfying sexual lives.
That's a fascinating data point. It just runs completely counter to the cultural narrative. So if the hormonal drivers are naturally receding with age, what's substituting for that initial biological pressure? What does satisfying even mean at that stage?
It's a profound psychological and emotional shift. Desire in older age often moves away from performance anxiety,
Hmm.
from purely biological metrics.
Like stamina or
Mhm.
or conforming to some youthful ideal.
Exactly. And it becomes intensely focused on connection, on comfort, and on the shared narrative of a life lived together. Intimacy becomes less goal-oriented and more about mutual appreciation and shared vulnerability.
I think that's the wisdom there, right? The shift from a quantitative, performance-driven thing to a qualitative, connection-driven one. And often, these older adults report a higher degree of satisfaction than they did in their younger years.
You do.
And it's precisely because they've shed those cultural expectations. They finally have the confidence and self-knowledge to define pleasure on their own terms. There's a freedom in that self-acceptance that just eclipses youthful insecurity.
That freedom is crucial, and it leads us right to the second major misconception we need to dismantle. This idea that sexual desire must always be spontaneous.
Oh, this is a big one, especially in long-term relationships.
A huge one. Spontaneous desire, that sudden, urgent biological urge, it's certainly real. But for so many people, especially those juggling modern stressors and kids and life, desire is overwhelmingly responsive.
Okay, so if I'm listening to this and I feel deep love for my partner, but that spark never seems to appear until we're already safe, comfortable, and connecting emotionally, I'm not broken.
Far from it. That's simply how your system works. Responsive desire doesn't initiate the interaction. It responds to a pre-existing context of safety, comfort, and emotional connection.
So the desire isn't absent. It's just waiting.
It's waiting for the right environmental cues. If your brain is busy running through the logistics for tomorrow, your safety system is preoccupied. It's a biological recognition that the necessary emotional environment just wasn't available for the system to confidently switch on.
Understanding that difference must be one of the most important steps in reviving desire in a long-term partnership.
It is often the single most important step.
This brings us directly to the link between our inner world and our physical world. Emotional intimacy is the non-physical fuel for physical passion. They aren't parallel tracks, they're completely intertwined.
They absolutely are. Emotional closeness and sexual desire, they share this complex, dynamic feedback loop. The more satisfied you are emotionally, the more available you are for physical satisfaction, and, vice versa.
And that link is just non-negotiable for long-term relationship satisfaction.
It is.
So what are the concrete, practical components that define this emotional intimacy? I mean, beyond just cuddling and talking, it has to start with security, doesn't it?
It starts with trust, which builds the necessary security for vulnerability. Emotional intimacy is that profound sense of being understood, accepted, and safe. When partners have that, they create the safe space required for physical vulnerability.
Because you can't be truly present or experimental in your sexual expression if you're worried about being judged or rejected.
Never. That emotional security allows partners to be radically more open during physical connection, which counterintuitively deepens pleasure because it removes the cognitive burden of performance or self-monitoring.
That removal of cognitive burden is huge. It takes all the pressure off. But there also needs to be a way to communicate what that vulnerability requires, which I guess that brings us to communication.
Open communication is the operational mechanism of intimacy. Emotional closeness encourages partners to engage in regular, honest discussions about not just their feelings, but their specific sexual needs and boundaries.
Right. So being able to express a less common desire or a specific boundary freely.
Yes. And when partners feel they can do that, it minimizes misunderstandings and ensures both people's needs are seen. Research consistently shows that couples who engage in open, non-judgmental dialogue about their sexual and emotional landscapes, they report significantly higher satisfaction levels across the board.
Just the ability to ask what felt good tonight without fear is essential.
It's everything.
And we can't overlook the external chaos that life throws at us. Stress, work stress, financial stress, health stress is arguably the ultimate passion killer. How does emotional intimacy buffer against that?
It acts as a powerful psychological shield. Emotional support, empathy, validation from your partner. It buffers the devastating impact of those external pressures.
It's almost impossible to prioritize physical closeness when your brain and body are stuck in high alert crisis mode about the mortgage.
Exactly. But when you feel seen and heard and supported by your partner, when they help calm your nervous system, it creates a safe, internal, emotional climate. That climate is what allows desire to step out of the shadows and thrive.
So it's a systemic function. Emotional security literally downregulates the stress response. Now, in the narrative of relationships, we always hear about the initial lust fading, which can be terrifying for couples. How does this emotional connection fundamentally change that typical biological trajectory?
Well, the initial phase, driven by novelty and peak hormones, is biologically designed to fade. But as couples invest in deep emotional intimacy, they start to view each other through a more positive, affirming lens. The shared history, the inside jokes, the trust.
All those accumulated layers.
Yeah, right. Those elements build a rich foundation that reinforces desire, essentially overriding that initial novelty factor. High emotional closeness consistently correlates with more frequent, more present, and more satisfying sexual interactions years, even decades, into a partnership.
I think we have to acknowledge, though, that desire can exist without emotional intimacy, right? I'm thinking of casual encounters driven purely by novelty or physical attraction.
Oh, absolutely. Those encounters exist, and they serve a purpose for some people at some times. But when we look at relationships that are intended to endure, the research is just unequivocal. A lack of emotional intimacy is consistently associated with a long-term decline in desire and satisfaction.
Lust fades. That's a biological fact.
It is. But deep emotional intimacy is the stabilizing factor that sustains and in some cases even increases sexual desire over many, many years. It transforms the experience from a physical transaction into a profound act of shared security and trust.
Okay, so if emotional intimacy provides the necessary safety and stability for desire to flourish, now we turn to the fascinating fact that desire itself is anything but stable. It's profoundly dynamic. And this brings us to the concept of sexual fluidity.
This concept is truly revolutionary. It challenges the old, rigid, categorical model of sexual orientation, the fixed labels of homosexual, heterosexual, even bisexual, implying these static identities.
Right. So fluidity doesn't deny orientation, but it recognizes that identity is more of a framework, not a cage.
Exactly. Sexual fluidity is defined as an individual's inherent capacity for fluctuation in their sexual response. And this can result from different contexts, relational dynamics, or simply the passing of time, whether that change is measured over decades or just 2 weeks.
And it's so important to clarify here, fluidity doesn't mean orientation is irrelevant or that everyone is secretly bisexual. It just means that an individual's identity label doesn't rigidly predict every single desire or response they will ever have.
That's the key. Some people are highly stable in their attractions. Others show significant documented variations.
And recent, very detailed analysis suggests that we shouldn't even treat sexual fluidity as one single concept. It's actually a complex interplay of distinct phenomena.
That's right. We can categorize this capacity for change into 4 distinct subtypes, which lets us move beyond just a simple description and actually understand the mechanics of shifting desire.
This breakdown is crucial for our listeners, for the learners, to grasp the nuance here. So walk us through these 4 types, maybe with a quick hypothetical to ground them.
Certainly. Okay, so the first is situational fluidity. This refers to an increased sexual responsiveness that's triggered specifically by external factors.
Like a particular social environment or a unique relational opportunity.
Exactly.
Ah,
For example, a person who identifies as strictly heterosexual might, when they're immersed in a highly charged, secure, and same-sex social environment, let's say an all-female sports team during a long, isolated tournament, they might find their sexual responsiveness is significantly amplified toward a teammate.
so the context itself created the conditions for that desire, even if it contradicts their typical preference.
Precisely. And research links this specific type of fluidity, this high responsiveness to the immediate situation, to an earlier onset of sexual activity and often a greater number of lifetime partners.
Which suggests that high environmental responsiveness translates directly into a broader range of sexual experiences.
hmm Now, the second type measures the structural difference between what's happening in your head versus what you're actually doing. That's attraction versus behavior.
So a mismatch between who you desire and who you have sex with.
Yes, it's the measurable discrepancy. Someone might identify as heterosexual and feel a primary attraction to the opposite sex, yet their behavior might include meaningful same-sex experiences, or vice versa. It just highlights that desire and action aren't always in perfect lockstep.
The third type seems to capture the sheer fuzziness of desire day to day, which I think a lot of people might find validating.
That's temporal instability. This assesses the extent to which an individual's attractions remain unstable and vary over time, sometimes even across very short time periods, like 2 weeks.
So this isn't about a major identity shift. It's about the microfluctuations.
It is the ebb and flow. Someone with high temporal instability might find their level of attraction toward a previously less preferred gender spiking briefly and unpredictably. It taps into the truly dynamic, almost wave-like nature of attraction.
And the fourth type is essential because it helps to conceptually separate fluidity from bisexuality, which are often mistakenly conflated.
That's responsiveness to the less preferred gender. This describes an individual's inherent capacity for an erotic response toward a gender they're generally less attracted to, without it necessarily leading to behavior.
So it's very close to the concept of bisexuality.
It is. And critically, in large-scale analyses, this was the only type of fluidity that was consistently and robustly associated with having a bisexual identity. It clarifies that while sexual fluidity is the capacity for change over time or context, bisexuality is the pattern of mixed attractions across genders.
That's a really powerful distinction. So you can be situationally fluid without necessarily having a high capacity for mixed attraction. And importantly, the analyses showed these 4 types are largely independent of one another.
That's right, you can be high in one and low in the others. The only slight correlation found was between temporal instability and responsiveness to the less preferred gender.
Which makes intuitive sense.
It does. If your capacity for attraction to a broader range of genders is higher, your overall attractions are naturally less anchored, making them more susceptible to short-term variation. This whole segmentation gives us a much clearer map of the spectrum of human attraction.
Okay, moving from these individual mechanics to population patterns, we hit a very persistent, well-documented finding. There is a significant gender difference in fluidity. Women consistently report higher rates of non-exclusive or bisexual attractions compared to men. This is across huge international studies. Why is that?
Well, there are 2 main explanations, biological and social, and they interact in a really powerful way. On the biological side, we look at what's sometimes called biological plasticity. It's a fundamental difference in how men and women process arousal.
And experimental research on this using physiological measures of genital arousal. The results are fascinating.
They really are. These are measures that are less subject to conscious self-report or cultural filtering. And what the study shows that women, regardless of their self-identified orientation, heterosexual, lesbian, bisexual, they often show similar generalized levels of genital arousal to sexual stimuli depicting their preferred sex and their non-preferred sex.
So their physical bodies, on a physiological level, appear to be more broadly responsive to sexual stimuli across the board.
Yes. Men, in stark contrast, typically show substantially less genital arousal to their non-preferred sex. Their physiological arousal is much more specific, much more highly aligned with their stated attraction.
So men's physical systems are highly specific, almost laser-focused, while women's physical systems demonstrate a greater physiological capacity for generalized arousal. That's a strong indicator of a fundamental sex difference.
It is, and what this biological plasticity means then is that the female sexual system may be inherently more permeable to social and relational cues, and that's where the social factors come in.
Right, because historically, female sexuality has been subjected to far greater social control.
Far greater, economically, religiously, culturally. Scholars argue that this massive social pressure may have historically limited women's ability to completely reject conventional heterosexual relationships, even if they experience deep same-sex desires, because the social and economic cost of nonconformity was, well, it was often catastrophic.
So the biological capacity for greater non-exclusive attraction, combined with those social constraints, would have made pursuing a bisexual pattern, maintaining a heterosexual relationship, while also engaging in same-sex desire or behavior, the most viable and safest path for many women.
Exactly. They were more likely to express their non-exclusive desires alongside heterosexual expectations, rather than adopting an exclusively same-sex identity that would lead to total social isolation. And we see evidence of this pattern changing as society evolves.
How so?
As social acceptance of same-sex sexuality has increased over the last few decades, studies show that rates of same-sex attraction and behavior have increased significantly. And these increases are consistently greater among women than men.
Which makes perfect sense. If the underlying biological predisposition for non-exclusive attraction was always there and the social barriers are now lowering, it's logical that women would be the group showing the largest change in reported behavior.
They are finally able to safely act on existing predispositions. It's the expression of a pre-existing capacity. For instance, studies tracking same-sex contact over a 20-year span found rates remained relatively stable among men, but increased linearly and substantially among women.
And the third key indicator of this fluidity, which is highly visible in national surveys, is the widespread inconsistency among the three components we use to define sexuality: attraction, behavior, and identity. We assume they all march in lockstep.
But they rarely do. The divergence is the norm, not the exception. We constantly see discrepancies. In surveys of adult populations, the percentage of women reporting some same-sex attractions is higher than the percentage reporting same-sex behavior, which is in turn higher than the percentage claiming a lesbian or bisexual identity.
The inner experience, the outward action, and the self-label are three different variables.
And perhaps the clearest manifestation of this sexual fluidity is the high rate of same-sex behavior among individuals who still identify as heterosexual.
And this phenomenon is strikingly more common among heterosexually identified women than men, right?
Across multiple studies, yes. And it just beautifully encapsulates everything we've been discussing. It reflects women's higher baseline prevalence of non-exclusive attractions and their greater responsiveness to situational factors.
So what does all this mean for the listener who might be experiencing shifts in their own desire or finding that their decades-long identity label feels suddenly restrictive?
It means that you are normal. Longitudinal studies focusing specifically on sexual minorities show that between 25 and 75% of individuals report substantial, measurable changes in their attractions over their lifespan. Change is common. In fact, it's almost expected.
So the takeaway is to treat your sexual self with curiosity and acceptance, not with rigid adherence to a label you chose years ago.
Your identity is a living document.
We've established that desire is responsive, deeply tied to emotional safety, and that identity itself is profoundly fluid. Now, we turn to the shadow side of human experience, where this entire complex system, the biological, psychological, and relational, is uniquely vulnerable to disruption. We have to discuss the profound impact of trauma.
Yes. The sexual self is perhaps the most sensitive aspect of our identity and functioning, precisely because it requires the nervous system to be in a state of safety and connection. Trauma, by definition, shatters that safety.
And it's crucial to understand we are not solely talking about sexual violence here, although that is obviously paramount.
No, we are talking about any major life-altering trauma. The spectrum is broad. It can include chronic emotional or physical abuse and neglect in childhood, which destabilizes attachment, terror experiences, military combat, serious accidents, even complicated traumatic birth experiences.
So any event that overwhelms the system's capacity to cope can lead to these long-term adverse effects on sexual functioning.
Because the core foundation, the safety and the ability to be present in one's body, has been compromised.
And the prevalence data really drives home the scope of this. It suggests it's an incredibly common and yet silent struggle.
It's a crisis. Studies focusing specifically on individuals with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, that's trauma characterized by repeated, prolonged experiences,
Right, not a single event.
not a single event. And these studies show that more than three-quarters of these individuals experience at least one trauma-associated sexual disorder. That statistic is staggering. It underscores that sexual issues should be understood not as a separate complication, but as a core symptom of the complex trauma itself.
If the nervous system's primary job after trauma is self-protection, and sex is an act of profound vulnerability, how does the nervous system respond to intimacy when it feels fundamentally unsafe?
The response is almost always a defensive one, and it explains the profound polarity we see in trauma-associated sexual distress. The trauma often forces the individual into two opposite, yet connected, defensive camps.
Okay, let's start with the avoidance side of that spectrum.
On one end, you have hyposexuality. This is characterized by sexual aversion, a profound emotional withdrawal, a decrease in or complete avoidance of sexual activity, and clinically diagnosable sexual dysfunction.
So difficulties with arousal, with orgasm.
Exactly. This response is often linked to traumas that began very young, last a long time, and involved emotional abuse or neglect with maybe minimal physical violence. The individual's nervous system learned that remaining small, withdrawing, and dissociating from the body was the safest survival strategy.
And then there's the opposite reaction, hypersexuality, which is often misunderstood as just having a high sex drive.
That's the critical distinction. Hypersexuality in this context is characterized by increased, often compulsive sexual activity, a loss of control, and increased sexual risk-taking.
It's serving a different defensive purpose.
A completely different one. It can be an externalizing of the trauma, sometimes a subconscious, compulsive reenactment of boundary violations, or an effort to use intense sensation to regulate or mask emotional numbness.
But the true hallmark of complex trauma isn't just ending up on one side of the spectrum, is it? It's the constant movement between the two.
That oscillation is the profound sense of ambivalence. That is the core experience of many trauma survivors. An individual might cycle rapidly between phases of extreme sexual avoidance where they feel completely shut down, followed by periods of overactivity or compulsion, where they seek intense but often emotionally empty encounters.
And clinically, that's understood as the person shifting between different defensive emotional states.
Or dissociated parts of the self. One part characterized by fear, shame, and withdrawal, the freeze-fawn response, and the other characterized by aggressive externalization or seeking temporary relief, the fight-flight response.
What are the specific factors that influence whether trauma leans toward hypo or hypersexual outcomes? It seems incredibly nuanced.
It is. The severity and context are critical. For example, individuals who experienced re-victimization, repeated sexual assaults, which confirms to the nervous system that the world is consistently unsafe, they show significantly more severe and complex sexual problems.
Like higher levels of sexual anxiety, shame.
Crushing shame, lower sexual self-esteem, and often more compulsive, risk-taking behavior compared to those who experienced a single event.
And there also appears to be a gendered influence on the style of the response, which is likely tied to cultural norms.
That's right. Broadly speaking, the empirical findings suggest that girls and women are more likely to internalize the trauma. This often expresses itself through phobias, deep-seated shame, and sexual withdrawal, the hyposexual profile.
And boys and men.
They may be more likely to externalize that pain through compulsive behavior, risk-taking, or seeking high-risk, low-intimacy encounters, the heterosexual profile. This may be heavily influenced by cultural scripts of masculinity that strongly discourage expressing weakness or victimization.
This complexity must reach its peak difficulty when a survivor attempts to form a secure, lasting emotional partnership. the evolution of a relationship can become a landmine.
It becomes a core conflict. The most difficult manifestation of sexual ambivalence often arises precisely when deep attachment is achieved.
What do you mean by that?
It's highly common for individuals with a trauma history to show a strong, even intense sexual interest at the start of a new relationship. The novelty and the distance make it feel safe. But as the emotional bond deepens, as the relationship becomes truly intimate, secure, and permanent, the very things they crave, that initial strong interest can abruptly switch to intense avoidance, fear, or aversion.
That is just heartbreaking for both people involved. The avoidance manifests precisely when the partner has succeeded in providing the safety and commitment that was sought. Why does the system sabotage itself at that moment of success?
Because true intimacy requires profound vulnerability and presence in the body. The deep attachment triggers the emotional danger system that was developed to survive the original trauma. The brain associates being deeply bonded and physically vulnerable with the conditions under which they were originally harmed,
So to protect itself, the system triggers withdrawal.
pushing the safe partner away because the safety itself feels unfamiliar and terrifyingly close to the memory of helplessness. It's a core conflict between the adult's desire for connection and the nervous system's mandate for survival.
Given how profound and widespread this connection is, 3/4 of CPTSD survivors, you noted that this topic remains strangely silent in therapeutic settings.
It remains a clinically suppressed topic, sadly. Sexual problems are massively underdiagnosed and undertreated in trauma therapy for some critical reasons. Many clinicians fear that discussing sex will destabilize a patient and trigger dissociation.
And there's a lack of established treatment protocol.
Right, and there is enormous shame and taboo surrounding the topic for both the patient and the therapist. It's the clinical dark continent.
So we have this therapeutic catch-22. The issue is integral to the trauma, yet it's often ignored because of its severity, which prevents true holistic healing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The counterpoint, championed by experts who focus on complex trauma recovery, is that addressing sexual dysfunction as an integral systemic part of the trauma symptomology is absolutely essential for healing. By naming the ambivalence, the avoidance, the compulsion, we begin to restore a sense of agency.
So the goal isn't always returning to some normal.
The realistic goal isn't always returning to a high-drive normal, but developing a sensual, pleasurable connection to one's own body and achieving a self-determined sexuality. This means defining pleasure and safety on the survivor's terms, rebuilding bodily ownership.
We've traveled through the mechanics of responsive desire, the fluidity of identity, and the deep scars of trauma. Now let's bring this back to the daily, granular realities of navigating relationships, which is where these complexities actually surface and cause conflict. A huge area of struggle is communication breakdowns from severely differing emotional needs.
Oh, this is a classic relationship pressure cooker. It often manifests when one partner requires deep, reflective conversations about feelings, hopes, anxieties. They need the poetry of life. And the other is focused almost exclusively on practical, factual matters. They only see the plumbing of the relationship.
Fixing the car, finances, work logistics.
Right, so the person meeting emotional depth feels starved, and the practical person feels overwhelmed by what they perceive as abstract, unnecessary drama.
And the consequence of this mismatch is compounded exponentially when paired with long-term emotional repression. When one partner consistently avoids emotional depth or hides dissatisfaction, that foundation of security we talked about just collapses.
The lack of consistent, honest emotional expression accrues what you could call an emotional debt. When a partner consistently avoids discussing their true feelings, hiding long-term dissatisfaction with their sex life, or suppressing doubts about the relationship, it guarantees a massive crisis down the line.
And when those profound issues finally surface, they erupt in shock for the other partner.
Total shock, because they genuinely thought everything was fine. Their partner was managing the repression so effectively.
You see this play out when a separation decision seems abrupt and unilateral. The shocked partner realizes they were living with someone who had been maintaining an elaborate facade for a year or more, never truthfully answering questions like, "Are you genuinely happy?"
Are you satisfied with our intimate life? That catastrophic error of repression, hiding deep, accumulated pain out of fear of conflict, takes what could have been small, manageable repairs and turns it into a total relationship-ending collapse. The silence becomes the biggest betrayal.
Beyond repression, relationships are strained by external stressors and critical boundary issues. We still see intense conflicts from unequal labor and outdated expectations, often rooted in gender roles.
This dynamic is a silent killer of desire and respect, even among modern dual-income couples. Conflicts arise when one partner views the other as, say, partner material for social events, but unconsciously expects them to operate as wife material or caretaker.
Meaning they're solely responsible for all the domestic labor, emotional labor, logistical organization.
All of it. And when one partner retreats into hobbies or work as a complete abdication of responsibility, it creates justifiable, chronic resentment.
And that resentment fundamentally destroys the emotional climate needed for responsive desire. It's hard to feel sexually available for someone you perceive as a disrespectful, selfish roommate.
Or a child you have to manage. Exactly. The partner left doing everything feels used and demeaned, and their responsive desire shuts down because the required condition, equal partnership and respect, is absent.
This brings us to the issue of betrayal and the complexity of modern boundaries, where technology dramatically amplifies the threat. Infidelity is so much broader now than just physical contact.
Absolutely. Emotional infidelity, the daily hidden non-physical contact with another person, sharing intimate details, seeking emotional support, and hiding those interactions is often just as, if not more, damaging than a single physical encounter.
Because it systematically violates the emotional boundaries and shatters trust.
Right. It doesn't matter if it was just texting. The secrecy and the depth of the emotional capital invested elsewhere are the betrayals that erode the relationship's security.
And the extreme lengths couples go to when trust is compromised. It really illustrates the depth of this wound. We see reliance on technological tracking, checking car location apps, sharing phone locations.
That behavior is a direct measure of the systemic breakdown of relational integrity, and often it's an acute manifestation of hypervigilance, a trauma response. While the act of tracking itself can create new problems, the impetus often comes directly from the deceptive behavior of the partner who violated those boundaries.
So if one partner is habitually lying, the betrayed partner's nervous system enters high alert, demanding hard evidence to reestablish safety.
It demonstrates the relationship has moved from a place of trust to one of constant anxious verification.
So if we accept that desire is dynamic, identity is fluid, and trauma leaves real measurable scars on our intimacy, what is the ultimate path forward for people navigating all these complexities?
The path forward is rooted entirely in authentic communication and, critically, self-determination. For couples, the immediate prescription is to reinforce those intimacy strategies, prioritizing open, consistent communication about feelings and boundaries, spending focused quality time together that isn't just about logistics.
And practicing genuine gratitude.
Yes, when sexual differences or fluidity inevitably arise, this toolkit allows them to navigate it without resorting to destructive repression or seeking external validation.
And for the individual, navigating their own fluidity or grappling with trauma, the ultimate destination is developing an authentic, self-determined sexuality.
That self-determination is the key to lasting satisfaction. It means moving beyond what society or past partners demanded and defining for yourself what actually gives you security, well-being, and pleasure. If you discover your sexuality is fluid, that is not a crisis. It is an invitation for honest exploration.
If you discover trauma is preventing pleasure, it is an invitation for gentle recovery and self-compassion.
The ability to articulate and pursue what makes you feel safe, seen, and truly alive is the ultimate goal.
We've reached the end of this deep dive, and we've covered immense ground. We've seen that human desire is less a fixed switch and more a responsive tide, dependent on safety and emotional connection.
We've established that sexual identity is far more fluid and nuanced than the categorical models once allowed, and that life's profound challenges, especially trauma, fundamentally reshape our most intimate connections.
And the knowledge that complex trauma so frequently manifests in sexual difficulties, be it avoidance, compulsion, or ambivalence, that should be a powerful corrective.
For too long, these issues have been marginalized in clinical and personal conversations because of shame. By naming this connection, we acknowledge that this isn't a moral or relational failure. It's a systemic disruption that requires systemic healing.
And understanding this complex picture of fluidity and responsiveness gives us all tremendous power. It reframes the goal. It's not just about trying to fix a sexual problem or force a return to some perceived normalcy that never existed. It's about building something resilient and authentic.
So here is our final provocative thought for you to carry forward. If your sexual experiences and desires are fundamentally unfixed, dynamic, and open to change, what new possibilities could you uncover by actively defining what a positive, self-determined relationship with your own body and your deepest needs truly looks like?
Focus on building security, honesty, and connection, and your desire will respond in kind. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.